What do Elvis Presley and the Soviet Union have in common? Nothing at all, except the fact that the king of rock and roll was deemed such a threat that the Soviets blacklisted him. His music was banned, his image suppressed, and his influence feared by those in power behind the Iron Curtain. But why would Elvis Presley, one of the most renowned musicians in history, be seen as a threat by the Soviet regime? Was it his charisma, his music, or something deeper? Why were the Soviets determined to silence him? The Soviet Union's ban on Elvis Presley's music wasn't a random decision. It was part of a broader effort to block Western cultural influences. During the early years of the Cold War, Soviet leaders saw Western culture as a threat to their control over people. Music, especially rock and roll, was seen as dangerous because it promoted ideas like freedom and rebellion, which went against Soviet values of unity and obedience to the state. This campaign against Western music didn't only target Elvis. Since the late 1940s, the Soviet government had strict rules to block foreign media they considered harmful. By the 1950s, as Elvis became globally famous, he became one of their main targets. His energetic songs and bold performances were everything the Soviets wanted to avoid. To them, Elvis represented the excess and moral weakness of capitalism, building a cultural divide between East and West. This also happened during the rule of Nikita Khrushchev, whose policies were somewhat softer than Stalin's, but still clearly strict. Western music was labeled as decadent and corrupting. In fact, in 1959, the Soviet Communist Party newspaper Pravda criticized rock and roll, calling it loud, primitive, and destructive for the youth. They didn't name Elvis directly, but his style and music were exactly what they were trying to fight. To enforce these rules, Soviet youth organizations like the Komsomol, a communist youth league, played a big role. They told young people to avoid Western culture. In schools, workplaces, and public events, they led campaigns against rock and roll, claiming it would make people lazy and rebellious. They insisted that foreign music wasn't for good Soviet citizens. For people caught with Elvis records or other Western music, the punishment could be severe. Smuggling Western music into the Soviet Union could be treated as anti-Soviet activity, which could result in fines, confiscation of the music, or even prison time. These harsh punishments showed how much the government feared the growing popularity of Western culture. It's hard to know exactly how popular Elvis was in the Soviet Union at the time because of these strict rules. Still, records of confiscated materials and underground music circles show that his influence was growing even when people couldn't openly talk about him. By trying to block Elvis and other artists, the Soviet leaders wanted to keep control over their society. But instead, they made Western culture even more exciting and mysterious. In the end, this ban only helped inspire a secret underground music scene that grew stronger over time. If the Soviet Union's goal was complete cultural control, then Elvis Presley represented everything they wanted to avoid. His image, music, and behavior symbolized a kind of freedom that directly challenged the restrictive values of the Soviet regime. For Soviet authorities, it wasn't just about the music, it was about what Elvis represented. In their eyes, Elvis embodied Western individualism, rebellion, and cultural freedom, all of which clashed with the core tenets of Soviet collectivism. His energetic performances and suggestive dance moves were viewed as morally corrupting, an example of how capitalism degraded society. Soviet officials feared such influences would inspire their youth to question authority and seek more personal freedoms. Soviet propaganda went so far as to frame rock and roll, including Elvis, as a deliberate psychological weapon. A declassified 1957 report by Soviet cultural policymakers described Western music as a tool of ideological subversion designed to destabilize the moral fabric of socialist youth. While Elvis wasn't directly named in the document, it was clear he fit the description of the type of influence they found most dangerous. In practice, the ban on Elvis and Western music meant suppressing access entirely. Soviet-controlled media avoided broadcasting his songs, and records were confiscated as contraband if smuggled into the country. In some cases, the authorities went further, associating the consumption of Western culture with outright criminal behavior. According to an article published in Izvestia, the official state newspaper, Western music, was a path to delinquency, and those caught promoting it faced severe punishment. The regime also attempted to offer Soviet-approved alternatives to Western music, sponsoring so-called officially acceptable bands that adhered to strict lyrical and performative guidelines. However, these imitations lacked the energy and appeal of artists like Elvis. As Russian cultural historian Artemy Troitsky noted in his book, Back in the USSR, "You couldn't create a Soviet Elvis. It wasn't just the music. It was his spirit that the regime could never replicate." The Soviet authorities' reaction revealed not just fear of Elvis, but also fear of what he might inspire, a generation unwilling to conform. Elvis wasn't dangerous because of his voice or his guitar. He was dangerous because he gave people a glimpse of a different way to live. Despite the Soviet Union's strict censorship, Elvis Presley's influence managed to seep through the Iron Curtain, often in surprising ways. While his records were banned and his music never aired on state radio, the allure of rock and roll was too strong to contain. Young Soviets, eager for a taste of the forbidden, found creative ways to access and share music from the West. One of the most unique methods was through so-called bone music, where banned records, including Elvis's songs, were illegally copied onto discarded X-rays. These makeshift records were cheaply produced and smuggled from person to person. Historian Stephen Coates, who documented this phenomenon, noted that Soviet youth were willing to risk punishment just to hear a few minutes of rock and roll. While the sound quality was poor, the message coming through the music was clear, a rebellious energy that connected deeply with listeners. Elvis also influenced Soviet youth through imagery. Photographs of him, sourced from smuggled Western magazines, or even recreated as crude drawings, became symbols of defiance. Soviet teenagers would imitate his hairstyle, his loose clothing, and even his signature sneer. Cultural historian Alexei Yurchak wrote in his study, "Everything was forever until it was no more," that emulating Elvis wasn't just a fashion choice, it was an act of subtle resistance in a society that demanded uniformity. Private gatherings also played a key role in spreading Elvis's music. These were clandestine concerts or listening sessions held in apartments where people would gather to enjoy Western music in secret. While most Soviet teens never experienced the full impact of Elvis's style firsthand, the underground culture he inadvertently inspired showed how powerful and subversive his image remained, even when his music was censored. Not everyone embraced this quiet rebellion. Soviet officials actively cracked down on these gatherings, linking them to hooligan behavior. An article in the party newspaper Pravda in 1961 warned that Western influences, particularly rock and roll, threatened to produce a generation of apathetic and undisciplined youth. Whether these accusations were valid or not, the ban on Elvis seemed to have achieved the opposite effect. It had made him even more legendary among Soviet youth. By trying to suppress him, the Soviet Union had unintentionally fueled his mystique. Elvis Presley became a symbol of a world that many Soviets could only dream about, a world where individuality and freedom were not just imagined, but lived. By the time the Soviet Union began to loosen its restrictions in the late 1980s, Elvis Presley had already become an enduring figure of rebellion and freedom for generations of Soviet citizens. For those who lived under the regime's strict censorship, Elvis symbolized much more than just music. He represented the possibility of cultural connection with the outside world. During the period of glasnost, introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev, Western culture began to flow more freely into the USSR. While some global icons, such as the Beatles, had already gained widespread underground popularity, Elvis retained a special significance. His position as an early figure in rock and roll meant he had already become a mythic symbol for many. For older Soviets, Elvis was the voice of a yearning for freedom they'd carried for decades, and for younger generations, he cemented his status as a historical force who had shaped music and culture worldwide. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Elvis's legacy in the former USSR transitioned from one of rebellion to one of nostalgia. Music that was once banned could now be celebrated openly, and Elvis's records became more widely available. Concerts featuring tribute bands and screenings of his movies brought his music and personality to audiences that had only known him through myths and scraps of illegal recordings. Even Soviet-born musicians cited him as an influence, acknowledging how his sound shaped the underground music culture that had flourished despite censorship. Interestingly, even Soviet leaders came to recognize the grip he held over their youth. In post-Soviet interviews, Gennady Karchenko, a former member of the Soviet Ministry of Culture, admitted that the regime had underestimated the power of Western music, saying, "You can try to silence a song, but you cannot silence the ideas behind it." Today, Elvis is remembered in former Soviet countries both for his music and for his symbolic victory over the censorship that tried to erase him. Public acknowledgement of his impact has only grown, with some cultural figures reflecting on how he represented an early fracture in the Soviet Union's ability to suppress outside influences. As cultural mediator Artemy Troitsky argues, Elvis was proof that even the most closed-off society couldn't fully shut out the universal language of music. Elvis Presley may never have set foot in the Soviet Union, but his voice, his image, and his message of freedom managed to permeate its walls. Though he was deemed a threat by the state, his legacy today stands as a reminder of how art and culture can transcend even the strictest barriers.